Morning, Daily Church. The Bible says we love him because he first loved us, and he says he loved us that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. That's really why we're here today. I'm so thankful for that. He didn't wait for Zacchaeus to come out of the tree. He didn't wait for the woman at the well to realize her past. He didn't wait for the woman at his feet to realize that she had sinned. He came to save us regardless. Today we find ourselves in the last of our series. I did not see that coming. Maybe that is the thing you didn't see coming, is when this would end. But here we are today in the last of these messages. And really everything we've done in this series has led to this last story. In Matthew in chapter 26, we're going to take a trip with Jesus and his disciples to the garden. And in this story, all of the things we've talked about over the last 7 weeks are coming to a head. In Matthew chapter 26 and verse 30, it says this: "When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Then Jesus told them, 'This very night you will all fall away on account of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep, the flock, will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee.' Peter replied, 'Even if all fall away on account of you, I never will.' 'Truly, I tell you,' Jesus answered, 'this very night before the rooster crows, you'll disown me 3 times. But Peter declared, 'Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you.' And all the other disciples said the same. Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.' He took Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, 'My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me.' I want to pause right there in the story just to set the stage here for you. First of all, I want you to notice that it's not often that the stories in the Gospels are shared by all 4 authors. Many times those stories might be in a couple of places, sometimes even in 3. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, often share many of the same stories. John often is writing about different things. But in this case and in a few others, there's a time when the story is told by all 4 of the Gospels. This is one of those rare occasions where Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all have recorded the events that occurred on this night and what they saw. Jesus and his disciples have just had the Last Supper. Just before that hymn they sang in verse 30, they have had the Last Supper. They have broken bread. They have drank the cup. Jesus had foretold them about what was about to happen, about his sacrifice and about his trip to the cross and about how he would die. They're still puzzled. They're a little confused. They're not fully sure of what he's talking about. But Jesus has just had this supper with him, and he then indicated to them that Judas is about to betray him. Peter is about to deny him, and in fulfillment of the prophecy in Zechariah, all of his disciples will scatter in fear. So after the meal, Jesus leads the disciples through the valley of Kidron and into the Garden of Gethsemane. It would have been about a half-mile walk from where they were having the Last Supper to the Garden of Gethsemane and through the valley of Kidron. I do want to show you on the map a little bit about where we are today. So we've been in Galilee and Samaria. We're in Judea again today. Last week we were in Jericho in the story. But today we're in Jerusalem in that small square. And you'll notice that small square over to your right. What you see there is Gethsemane, pointed almost looking like it's in Jerusalem. The reality is it's not. It's right on the outskirts of Jerusalem. But in that small square where Jerusalem is pointed, that's really where most of the crucifixion events occurred. That's where the Valley of Kidron is at, just on the edge of Jerusalem there. And that's where Gethsemane can be found, at the foot of the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is the mountain range there that overlooks Jerusalem. And while it sits right outside the city of Jerusalem, it's not actually part of Jerusalem. The word Gethsemane means oil press because it sits at the base of the Mount of Olives, and there are lots of olive trees across the mountain and in the garden. The presence of olive trees there means that they need a press. And so Gethsemane means oil press because in the garden, there is a large oil press, a giant stone probably, that would have been used to place the olives underneath. It would have pressed down on them. They would have extracted the oil and used it for cooking and for eating. This is the place, however, that you should know that most believe in Revelation portrays as the place where Jesus will return to hold his final judgment, a place where he will reestablish his kingdom on earth in the Valley of Kidron. So this is certainly a place of great significance. Know that many people, whether Muslim, Jewish, or Christian faith, believe that this is a very significant place, so much so that many have bought plots there on the hillsides, the Valley of Kidron, where they have been buried. because they believe one day that is where Jesus will return, whether they see him as a prophet, as a teacher, or as a Messiah. So it's a very significant place. I want to show you a few pictures of the garden today. This is the Garden of Gethsemane today and what it looks like. You see a lot of olive trees, a lot of very ancient trees. We don't know exactly how old because they'd have to cut them in order to see how old, but this is what the garden likely would have looked like even that evening that Jesus and his disciples visited. It would have been a lot of trees and flowers, very simplistic. There's nothing ornate. And you can see that there are just some stone paths. There are some very old trees. All of those are olive trees, mostly, that you see there. That would have been part of that Mount of Olives. So Jesus would have walked these very paths that night in this story, his disciples on the outer edges of the garden. And in these last couple of pictures, what you're going to see is the view from the garden, because this garden really overlooks the city of Jerusalem. What would have been there on that mountainside would have been the temple, which is there now today, a version of the temple, but it would have seen the temple in Jerusalem. In that same area, the Valley of Kidron and that part of Jerusalem would have also been where the high priest's house would have been. This is where all the crucifixion events would have occurred. Not far from there would have been the hill of Golgotha. You would have seen the Herod's house where he will try Jesus. You will have seen a lot of different places that happened during the crucifixion right in this spot. And so there is some disagreement about how much you can have seen from the Garden of Gethsemane then, because there may have been a wall. But regardless, this would have been the view, if there was not a wall there, that Jesus might have even seen that night walking through the garden. As you look down onto Herod's house and to the high priest and to the senior leadership and into the city, and also to see the temple. And I just want to really put your mind into that picture tonight, because today's message is really not about us. I want to be really clear. A lot of times we share a message with you about what lessons we can learn and how we can grow and what is about us. This message is not about us at all. This is a difficult topic for most people, and you don't see them spending a whole lot of time doing an entire message on the Garden of Gethsemane because it is such a heavy idea. But more importantly today, I just want to make all the focus about Jesus. I just want to focus on what Jesus did that night in the garden and make it all about him and not about us at all. I want to show you what Jesus would have experienced that night and help put you in the mindset of what Jesus went through. Every story we have read up to this point in this series has been preparing for this Garden of Gethsemane moment. And in these first verses that we've already read, I want you to notice one thing. Jesus himself had a place to pray. As a matter of fact, in Luke's gospel, it says that Jesus came here often to the Garden of Gethsemane. And one of the authors says, as was his custom, which means it was a regular occurrence. The Garden of Gethsemane is where Jesus came to talk to his Father. He had a place to pray, and the Garden of Gethsemane was it. When Jesus came here that night, it wasn't the first time. They weren't going to check out the garden. This was a place Jesus often came to pray to his Father. When he wanted to get alone and talk to God, this was a place that Jesus came. And so know that Jesus himself had a place to pray, and this was his spot. Imagine Jesus walking through the garden that night. As he enters the garden, he leaves 8 of his disciples there, and he takes 3 of them on with him further in, on his mind that night as he thinks about God's ultimate plan. Why he has been spending the last 3 or so years preaching and teaching and healing and talking about himself as the Messiah, the fulfillment of the prophecy, talking about Isaiah and Zechariah and other authors who've described his coming. But second thing I want you to notice is that even Jesus desired to have his friends with him when he was facing difficulty. Now you'll notice there are 8 who are left at the gate, and there are 3 that go with him. Well, 8 plus 3 is 11. Someone's missing. Well, already Judas has scurried away. Judas has already left. Between the Last Supper, when he was told he would betray, and the time they get to the garden, Judas is already gone in that half-mile stretch. He has scurried away to betray Jesus. So when Jesus arrives, he leaves 8 of the disciples on the outer edge, and then he takes Peter and James and John with him, the sons of Zebedee, deeper into the garden. It's then that the 3 disciples see Jesus agitated in a way they've never seen him before. You see, Jesus has been angry. We watched him flip the tables in the temple. We've seen Jesus disappointed when people didn't believe in him. We've seen Jesus frustrated, often at the disciples. We've seen a lot of times when Jesus wasn't happy and joyful. There were plenty of times when he was frustrated, concerned, confused at why people still couldn't understand, but never had they seen him like this, agitated in a way they had never seen before. And the third thing in that section I want you to realize is that even Jesus faced sorrow. It says he faced sorrow even unto death. It was so powerful, it was like he was dying of sorrow. Jesus is not so fearful, by the way, of the physical pain and terrible torture that's ahead of him. I want to be really clear. This is much more about the great battle that is about to begin. You have to understand this is the moment in human history when everything changes. This is the moment that since the beginning of Jesus' existence with God, and in the beginning was God, and the Word was with God, and this is the moment. Everything changes, hinges on this moment of what's about to happen. All the demonic forces of hell were working overtime as the fierce wrath of God was also about to be unleashed. So you have to understand that not only was Jesus on his mind about what was going to happen with all the demonic forces of hell out to destroy him, but also the fact that he knew what was about to happen with his own Father. His Father, who had been eternally connected to him, is about to turn his face away in shame and disgust and be unwilling and unable to even look at Jesus. I mean, it's one thing to fight all the forces of death and hell, but it's another to also know that the person, the Trinity, your Father, the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Like, all of a sudden, you've been disconnected. He can't even look upon him because he is about to become sin. Jesus was about to take on himself the weight of all of mankind's sin. I can barely carry my own baggage. I cannot imagine what it must have been like to walk through the garden that night as you were about to take on the world's baggage. He was about to take the filthy and deeply depraved immorality of all of mankind as his own. He would be forced to carry that alone, deserted by his friends, despised by the demonic forces of this world, and also rejected by his own Father. He knew that as he stood in the garden and began to allow the events that were about to unfold in his mind, events that would set in motion in just a matter of moments, he couldn't even stand the sorrow. And I just want us to really focus today on what that means as he's standing in that garden, as he's talking to his Father. The sorrow that he expresses to the disciples is so great. Then picking the story back in verse 39, it says, after he left the three there, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and prayed, my Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. Well, can you believe? I mean, Peter just said he would die for him, and he can't even stay awake for an hour. Couldn't you men keep watch with me for 1 hour, he asked Peter. Watch and pray so that you'll not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. He went away a second time and prayed, my Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. So he left them, didn't even bother waking them up this time, and went away once more, genuinely alone. Alone. The most sad alone you could ever be. And prayed the third time, saying the same thing. God, if there's any other way, let it be. But if this is the way, I will do your will. Have you ever found yourself so helpless, so scared, so worried, so hopeless, so frightened, so much agony that all you can do is fall on your face before God? That's where Jesus was. He was so perplexed by what was about to happen that all he could do was cry out to his Father, God, if there's any other way, please let that be the way. But if this is it, I'll do it. Luke's gospel says that he was praying so earnestly in the garden that night that his sweat was like drops of blood. This is a medical condition known as hematohydrosis. And it only happens in extreme situations where someone is in such fear, anger, agony that the blood actually seeps from their skin. What I want you to notice is that even Jesus wants to avoid the suffering. But knowing what was on the line, he asked that God's will be done. You know, the safest place for us to be is in God's will. That's where his protection is strongest. That's where his provision is the largest. That's where his grace is the most visible. But for Jesus, these moments in the Garden of Gethsemane are the final moments before he faces Calvary. The final moments before he faces the cross and the trials and the beating and the mocking and the betrayal. This is it. This is the only time that's left before all of that is about to occur. Jesus knows that everything is about to change. There'll be no more healing the sick and walking through town and preaching in the temple. He is about to be destroyed as a man once and for all and sacrifice himself to give us life eternal. Everything is about to change. His conversation with the Father is really all that stands between you and me and eternity. Gethsemane is where he waits on the edge as he battles with what comes next and something he knows will be terrifying to his very soul. Again, not only because of the pain and the rejection of the people he has come to love and trust here on earth, but because he knows his Father will turn away from him because he can no longer look upon the sin that he will bear. And we know that it happens because during the crucifixion, it says the sky turned dark at the moment that God had turned his back on his Son who could no longer look upon him. Imagine the loneliness, the fear, the scared terror, the sheer frustration. Going back to the story in Matthew 26 and verse 45, it says, "Then Jesus returned to the disciples and said to them, 'Are you still sleeping and resting?'" Like, seriously? "Look, the hour has come and the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." While he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him was a large crowd armed with swords and clubs sent from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had arranged a signal with them. "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." Going at once to Jesus, Judas said, "Greetings, Rabbi." Oh, the nerve. And kissed him. Jesus replied, "Do what you came for, friend." Then the men stepped forward, seized Jesus, and arrested him. With that, one of Jesus' companions, many believed to be Peter, reached for his sword, drew it out, and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. "Put your sword back in its place," Jesus said to him, "for all who draw the sword will die by the sword. Do you think I cannot call on my Father, and he will at once put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels? But how then would the scriptures be fulfilled that say it must happen in this way?" In that hour, Jesus said to the crowd, "Am I leading a rebellion that you've come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I sat in the temple courts teaching, and you did not arrest me, but this has all taken place that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all the disciples deserted him and fled. But that didn't take long. Truly alone. And now submitting. Arrested in chains. For what? For being blameless? For being a teacher? For being a miraculous person? For telling people about God's love? What's the charge? But Jesus submits willingly. But I want you to notice that even Jesus was betrayed. First, Judas sells him out for 30 pieces of silver. Then his disciples flee, leaving him alone, even though they promised they would die for him. And soon Peter denies him 3 times in the shadow of the cross. Imagine the feeling of knowing how much time you spent with these men. These are the same people who saw you heal the sick, who saw him feed the 5,000, who saw him raise Lazarus from the dead, who saw him forgive the woman at the well, who saw him walk on the water, who saw him calm the storm that they were in, and who saw him willingly surrender the high priest. And after this, they all just scatter. Betrayal. Alone. Abandoned. Because the reality is, ladies and gentlemen, the only Jesus could fulfill the scriptures. Jesus reminded his disciples and all those who came to arrest him, he could call 12 legions of angels. I don't know how many angels that is, but it's a lot. And they would have destroyed all of those folks coming to lay their hands on Jesus. He could have easily said, God, not today, this isn't happening, and Jesus would have been rescued immediately. What you see in this story is the ultimate in surrender to God's will. He knew that you and I needed a Savior. He knew there was no hope for mankind unless he willingly went to the cross. He even reminds them they could have arrested him at any point. He was at the temple all the time. He was out in the streets, on the hillside. The Pharisees were there all the time. The high priest had access to him whenever. But he wants them to know that even in their evil and unjust arrest, they too are fulfilling the prophecy in Isaiah and Zechariah and many others. I want you to reflect for just a moment on the fact of where we're leaving Jesus in this story. Because this is where we're leaving him. Standing in the garden, arrested, in chains, being dragged away, ready to face the ultimate choice for you and me. Ready to face the prosecution for crimes he didn't commit, the beatings, the abuse, the spitting, the betrayal, the mock trials, and ultimately hands and feet nailed to a cross where he would hang for hours on end and die a gruesome criminal's death, while Jesus himself experienced his own Father turning away from him and ready to face death and hell himself. I don't know how that's possible, but I know that's what happened in the garden that night. He made the ultimate choice for you and me. He willingly surrendered himself to be taken, to become sin for us, and to sacrifice to redeem us from certain death and forever separation. I can't comprehend that, but the message is not about us today. I told you that. This message is not about me. It's not about you. It's about him. It's about what Jesus did for us. And today is a day to reflect on the price that was paid so that we could be redeemed. I'm going to ask the band to come. We're going to end this service just a little differently today. In a moment, they're going to sing a song. It says once and for all, because that's what this was about. And today, I'm going to ask you to really focus on what happened in the garden that night. Think about the events that occurred when Jesus walked in that night with his 11 disciples. Think about the betrayal. Think about the pain, the suffering, the torture in his mind, what he was about to surrender to, the moment that he could have rescued himself, but he chose not to. I want you to focus on that. Would you stand to your feet? Today, my invitation is this. I cannot imagine what happened with Jesus that night in the garden, but I'm so thankful. And today, all I'm going to do, and I'm going to invite you to join me, is I'm going to kneel right here. And I'm going to thank him for what he did. It's not about us. It's about him. And I'm going to invite any of you that want to join me here today to take this opportunity to thank him for what he did that night in the garden. Because ultimately, that is where the decision was made, where our salvation would ultimately be done. And so as they sing today, I invite you to join me if you choose.